Carter, any bodily noises?
What?
All right, there it is.
Yeah,
That's
there you
always okay.
go.
Welcome to our Presser Podcast. I'm Micah Sander,
I'm Carter Green.
and today we sat down with Professor Chris Warren. Professor Chris Warren specializes in the history of medicine and public health in the United States. He received his BFA from Florida State University, his MLA from the University of South Florida, and his PhD from Brandeis University, and is working on a book tracing the history of America's migration into the indoors. His doctoral dissertation, The Silenced Epidemic, A Social History of Lead Poisoning in the United States Since 1900, won the American Society for Environmental History's Rachel Carson Prize. He is the author of Brush with Death, A Social History of Lead Poisoning, which won the APHA's Arthur Viseltear Award, co-author of Silent Victories, The History and Practice of Public Health in 20th-Century America, and completing his latest book, Starved for Light, How Rickets and Vitamin D Deficiency Shaped Modern America. He has published articles in the Journal of Southern History, Business History Review, and Public Health Reports, and guest editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post. To talk a little bit about Professor Warren, we have today with us Rachel. Welcome, Rachel, to our Professor Podcast.
Hello.
Rachel, can you tell us a bit about what it's like taking a class with Professor Warren?
So I took Warren's Bad Habits and Moral Panics and his American Medical History class. So based off those, I can say that having a class with him is fun, period, done with the interview. But no, the best way I can describe his teaching style is info dump with drama, because he's kind of theatrical, but also thorough with information on whatever the day's topic is. And what I mean by theatrical is that he fully gives you a sense of what the thought process behind changes or decisions, reactive actions of people were by the way he would insert himself into historical characters and explain like how parents felt and reacted to their kids' participation in moral panics, like, oh my god, our kids are having sex on cliff sides, or just give a vivid description of stuff like what memory I have is when he was teaching about, I think, the development of amputations during the Civil War, and he acted out the sawing of a leg, or when he was explaining bloodletting and just stuff like that. And just to praise how his teaching style impacts, I think that the Bad Habits and Moral Panics course in my first semester at Brooklyn College navigated my later studies by teaching me that like studying history can be entertaining and an engaging practice, not just boring and simple memorizations or whatever, and that even moments and aspects that seem minor in their time can end up being significant. Because stuff like freakouts over Dungeons and Dragons and contemplations over how to market cigarettes are valuable not only to understanding the larger world they reside in, but also as their own focuses. And that same sentiment goes towards the medical history course as well. They're also just really good classes. The Bad Habits Moral Panics was online, so I don't really remember much, but my medical class was in person, and I remember it just felt like alive. And I think a big part of why was because he's really good at making class discussions feel more like conversations, and is pretty open to questions. He's great at encouraging people to just be active and talk. Like, he would have us do group work pretty often, and what we would like circle up and share what we found from a reading or our own research or whatever for a few minutes, and then every group would talk to the rest of the room, and that always just felt easy and like kind of fun.
Now, when it comes to workload for Professor Warren, what's it like?
The workload is a mix of like a lot but also enough. Like, he does assign a lot of readings, but they are pretty good readings, and we do go over them in class. I remember he would also point out the ones to like specifically pay attention to, but the paperwork is about every other week. And it's also like short, like a page or two. But around midterms, it does feel like a little more just because we have a mix of the exams to study for, which are like in a quiz format with a paper and short responses. Papers for things... This is so specific. The papers for the exams aren't due during the in-class exam. You just write them out at home or wherever your own time is located. For the regular paper topics that are like every other week are actually kind of fun to do because you usually get to just pick your own topic based off whatever the prompt is. Like for one paper I wrote about alcohol use following the 2008 recession. I think I wrote another one about the parental advisory logo. I remember in medical history, one paper that I always think about is the issue of husband stitch and coarse C-sections, and also like what happened before abortion was legal. Very fun topics. I mean, there's not a lot of classes where I think you really get to do that. He also has a movie-based paper for each class, which I remember for medical history, we had a class day called Movie Day, where he would put up the trailers for the movies we picked, and as we explained what they were about and how they related to medical history, and that was pretty fun. We also spent the semesters working on our research projects independently, or for medical history, there was like an option to do a book review, which he gave a long list for, one being his own book. I remember somebody asked if he would be more critical if you used his book, and he said yes. But you could also suggest a book in your proposal, which, by the way, the projects, how they worked were, first you submitted a short proposal of like 3 topics, worked based on whatever he approved, which for me both times were all 3, so like we've been working on it. And that was one of my favorite memories of Bad Habits, actually, because it was online and I kind of just got to go all out with my presentation. It was really fun. For medical history, the project presentation was a quick talk and you get to make a 1-sheet handout for the class. And for both classes, he would pitch in on people's topics. For my research paper in Bad Habits, which I actually picked at a moral panic, he pitched in asking how the topic is historicized, follows the moral panic outline. And that was included in other people's presentations with the medical history class, where I think we all pitched in questions as well. Book review for that one, actually. So I don't remember what the comments I got on were. And the book I picked was a ginormous book. And I picked it 2 weeks before, and I was open my presentation that I hadn't finished with it, and he was he made a joke that was something like, oh yeah, when you pick a Rosenberg book, was it? Yeah, I think it was Charles Rosenberg. So through both the semester projects and papers, his classes aid in practicing research skills, which if you like research and working with primary sources is really fun. For me it was. And as history students, I think I should point out how it is really helpful and useful, because I think that's one of the things our department emphasizes as a skill to come out of the major, but in his classes, it's an actual consistent practice to the point where, now I feel like I find things on anything easily. And I mentioned it already, but sometimes we would go over what we found from our own research, and those would always be fun class discussions. There was a day towards the end of medical history where it was, I think the topic was death, and we all had to look up different ways to dispose of dead bodies. And I remember our first assignment for that class was also a scavenger hunt of information, where you had to find the answers to the questions through research just to prepare for the rest of the semester's work, and also just prepare to know how to research on your own. I personally enjoy doing the coursework as much as being in the classes. You learn a lot, but you also learn how to learn with a genuinely cool professor.
This has been a magnificent portrait of Professor Warren. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the thought you put into your answers. We've loved having you here on our Professor Podcast. This episode that we did with Professor Warren, there were a few Wi-Fi issues. So if you hear something that's not your device, it was on our end. But otherwise,
it might be your device.
Or it might be your device. That's a good point. I don't know what you got.
We're perfect.
But anyways, I hope you enjoy, and please welcome Professor Chris Warren.
Whoa! All right, Professor Warren, thank you so much for sitting down, having this talk with us. So let's get right into it. The first question is, why did you choose your area of study? How did it change and develop? And was there anyone particularly important in your career path or any stage of your education?
Been a long and winding road to where I got. How I ended up in front of a college history class starts from when I was in teaching middle school in St. Petersburg, Florida. As with many of our education students here, there was a strong incentive to get a master's degree. And I started taking classes at the local university. They had a wonderful program called getting a master's in liberal arts, which is kind of, what the heck is that? It was kind of a menu. You had to take some classes in literature, some classes in geography, classes in sociology, a class in history. And I found, as I went through, I was taking these classes, and okay, my literature class, the class I wanted to take was politics and history in literature. And the geography class I was attracted to was historical geography. And then, of course, the professor who I knew the best was a historian. He's Ray Arsenault is his name, and he's a historian of the American South. And he really turned my head around on what history could be. And I was taking his history methods class, and my master's thesis was going to be about cocaine. as a product. But then, as it happened, things in my life got us interested in lead paint. We were restoring an old house and we were raising a child, and the two of them came together as a panic. That interested me deeply. So my professor, he liked what I was writing. He liked what I was doing in class. He thought I had what it takes, and I don't know, he didn't blackmail me, but he definitely put the screws on and said, this is what you need to do. And off I went. Children and wife in tow to Massachusetts, leaving Florida to get a degree in American history.
You mentioned teaching middle school math, and your undergrad was a performing arts degree. Do you see a link between these seemingly unrelated experiences and your career now? Like, what did you pick up along the way that's added to your historian and professor skill set?
Yeah, lots of different things. I mean, when I first started giving my first academic talks as a historian in medical history, there would always be a guy in the audience who had to ask, how can you do medical history when you're not a doctor? And, with my checkered past, could be a hard question for me, but I managed never to reply, what do you mean? How can you do the history of medieval France? You're not French. You were born in the 20th century. You never suffered from worms, and you apparently never thought deeply enough to consider what a clueless question that was. So instead, I let my natural self-deprecation take the wheel, and I answered, well, you're right, I'm not a doctor, but I have a BFA in theater, so I know how to act like I know what I'm talking about. And that usually worked. But, I didn't follow the regular K to PhD route. That's clear. And there's lots of activities in the years in between that I don't put in my resume, which is not to say that what I was doing then was practicing and doing field research for my class in bad habits. That's not what I was doing. When I look back at what I was doing between college and getting back into teaching, those were years where I was doing field research, but it was field research in what it meant to be living in your 20s under late stage capitalism, much like what you guys are facing today. So that was my field research.
There's those that think there's a really hard boundary between history and science, but your work requires you to understand both. For example, a shameless plug here, but your upcoming book, Starved for Light, How Rickets and Vitamin D Deficiency Shaped Modern America. You look at how rickets is intertwined with the emergence of modern medicine and how people get their vitamin D to fight the apparent resurgence of rickets. We've seen how both fields are extremely susceptible to human shortcoming and manipulation. Racism and individual bad actors, for instance, easily create a bad history and bad science. First, how much bad history and bad science do you encounter in your research? And secondly, does understanding the science of one of your topics helps you understand the history and vice versa?
Okay, that's really great. The subject of bad history, I used to run for a few years a really wonderful medical history library. And the librarians there, they largely dealt with medical doctors who were very interested in history, but it was clearly an avocation for them. If one of them bothered them a little bit, they referred to these guys as dabbling docs. And so there's a lot of medical history. And as I was kind of surprised as I delved into the historiography of my topic, vitamin D and rickets, a lot of it was done by, I don't want to call them dabbling docs, but docs who were not trained in history. So what that shows up as when you do this research is a lot of kind of mythical history. Great doctors of the past who saw the problem and knew what to do and were steadfast in making progress. And there were a lot of doctors that they were studying who actually probably were doing junk science sometimes. So there's a lot of, bad history writing, or I don't want to say bad because I'm a nice guy. I don't like to say it's bad, but kind of, it's amateur. Some of the science that was done was certainly not of the highest quality. Nobody had done what I'm doing, which is to take the entire history of vitamin D deficiency and rickets. And initially, this was just going to be a small case study within the larger book that I'm working on now. But the more I read about it, the more I saw how interesting it was. And you might not think that rickets could possibly be interesting, but what I found, and this is kind of the informal elevator pitch I give for the book, is that rickets, I cast rickets as the Forrest Gump of medical history, because it was really right there at the center of about a half a dozen of very critical developments in the history of modern medicine. For example, one of the things that social historians of medicine are really interested in has been gender and the literal takeover by male doctors of the traditional obstetrics practice, which was, largely midwifery. And the reason that they could do this was definitely aided by a growing crisis in Rickets, which was causing obstetrical complications, that the men stepped in with their newly invented instruments and they're there, dear, we can fix this. And they really were able to move into place because of Rickets. Of course, modern nutrition science, where does it? Yes, I know vitamin D is the fourth one of those vitamins. A, B, C, and D were discovered first, but it still is right there in being one of the really most scientifically interesting of those vitamins, the early vitamin being discovered. And then, of course, even surgery, orthopedic surgery, the history of that, which is a great field for dabbling docs. They love to write about which surgeon taught who and what did they teach and what were their innovations. But I tell you, we wouldn't have the development of especially around pediatric surgery. There was a whole generation of doctors who were trained by trying to straighten out all these bow legs and rickety legs. So it's there, and of course, it's not a straightforward study of progress. That's one of the things that became very clear. One of the other things that I find Rickets being involved in is the history of ethics and its role in medical ethics. The doctor who wrote the first most significant modern code of medical ethics that the AMA still has as their code of ethics, name is Percival. In the late 18th century, he was experimenting on children in his clinic in Manchester, giving them cod liver oil in a completely ethical setting where the parents were involved and people knew what they were doing. This is in the late 18th century. Skip ahead to 150 years later. I show studies in the United States done in the 1930s on institutionalized infants, where the doctors held them in dark hospital wards so that they would develop rickets. They actually induced rickets in these institutionalized kids. For what? So they could test this medication, one version of vitamin D or another, that they already knew was effective. So these were pretty horrific and unethical studies. So yeah, it doesn't always move forward. And in terms of bad history, I debunk a few, or I try to take a few of the heroes down just a notch, but only as much as they deserve. I'm not in it to overthrow. I don't want to upset the dabbling docs too much.
A lot of students have raved about your classes. Do you have a single approach to teaching every class, or does it vary? Pretty much what can a student look forward to coming into one of your classes?
Well, I mean, a few of us in the department teach these massive 120-seat section, and for me, that's different. That's more, I surrender to being the sage on the stage with kind of conventional, multiple choice quizzes and low stakes writing. I mean, they still have to write, but I make it so that, you have to meet all the students where they are. One of our biggest strengths is our diversity at Brooklyn College, but that diversity also includes preparedness for college work. So in those big seated classes, I need to be very flexible in that. But now in the history classes, yeah, I have a pattern, which is we read a fair amount. We read a fair amount of both primary and secondary literature. I tend to lean into journal articles more than asking them to buy and fully read a dozen books. So we read a lot of journal articles. We read, in our case, if we're doing medical history or we're doing in the bad habits class, there's a lot of professional literature from other fields. So medical literature, sociological, criminological, journal literature. And so we do some deep dives on that. The writing that I do, I'm a big fan of this idea of low stakes assignments to keep people engaged on a week-to-week basis. But then there's usually going to be a research project that I try to make as open to the possibility of meeting their interests and not simply checking some box in my curriculum. In terms of discussion, I'm a big fan of it, and I do my best to encourage a class where people are free to talk about uncomfortable things. We cover a lot of uncomfortable topics in both medical history classes and in the bad habits class. And so people have to feel free and respectful of each other. So there's a lot of energy that goes into making that.
I want to talk a little bit about your bad habits class. Looking at the syllabus, there's no surprise why it's so popular. You have days dedicated to discussing drinking, policing sex, bad habits in movies and smoking and comic books panic, swearing, liberating and enslaving pleasures, sex since the 60s. I mean, the syllabus alone, I already want to take 2 of the class. Um, what is studying bad habits and moral panic reveal about U.S. history that isn't in more common narratives?
One thing that is a through story on this is sometimes I do it on purpose and sometimes it just comes out. When I'm talking about, so what we're doing, what's on the syllabus for the next week is like, all right, we're doing drugs next week, or tomorrow, don't forget, we're all doing heroin tomorrow. And I hear myself say it, I'm not even sure whether I meant it as a joke or what. But to your question, I mean, it's a really good question. Is this just us coming in for a semester and snickering at all the moral panic? Is this just a bunch of prudes losing their minds over what the kids are doing? Is that all there is to it? No, indeed, it's not. We do take things seriously. But, to get to your question, what does it have to do with bigger stories? I'll bring in medical historiography to do this. There's a foundational book in modern medical history. It was Charles Rosenberg's 1962 book, The Cholera Years. Wow, that sounds like a rip-roaring, who's going to want to read that? That's something for dabbling docs, right? Well, Rosenberg looked at one disease, cholera, in one city, New York, over 3 distinct epidemics that were scattered out over about 30 years in the middle of the 19th century. 30 years over which medical science really did not advance all that much. Not a story about medical progress curing rickets. I mean, sorry, obsession, curing cholera. But what it does, it's the same germ, same location, pretty much the same paradigms in place, but there's 3 dramatically different responses to these 3 epidemics. And it was a brilliant way to do a kind of controlled observational and cultural, it was like turning the city into a laboratory as a controlled experiment for history. So I think looking at bad habits is similarly powerful as an analytical instrument. The behaviors that trouble us change over time, and how we choose to respond to what troubles us changes over time in really interesting ways. So you study those changes in what we condemn. It says a lot about who we were and why we were that way, and how we changed, how we got to where we are, and how we're still mixed up in so many of the same dynamics. If you want one just simple example, something I'm sure the basic history of is the history of cocaine. A century ago, it induced panic in the South when African-American dock workers were snorting cocaine. And oh my God, the South went into a panic about these African Americans taking this energizing drug that's going to create crime and mayhem. But it was at the same time set in a different setting. It was a harmless kick that Cole Porter could joke about, as a sniff of which he's sure he's not going to admit that he's doing it, but he's sure if he took a sniff, he'd be terrifically bored. But it was something he would joke about in another setting. Now you skip ahead to the 1970s, and it becomes, in the disco era, cocaine was a costly party drug that the elites partook. Well, it was all sorts of other things, but that was the mythic image of it. And a decade or so later, just a generation later, the same drug, re-engineered as crack, became the root of moral panics and ended up being one of the causes for the hijacking of our criminal justice system, which we're still coping with. So, yeah, that covers a lot of American history.
Do you have a favorite bad habit to either do or talk about, or that you see is very popular, gets a lot of excitement from the students when you guys talk about it?
Oh, I forgot we're not visual here. I pointed to my cup of coffee. So coffee's definitely, caffeine is definitely up there. No, I don't have a favorite. I'm terrible with favorites. But, the thing about studying bad habits in the way that I just described, and teaching it especially, it really changes you can't have the same attitude towards addiction and addicts when you study where these habits sit in a commercialized multinational nexus of both product and government, society. It makes it impossible to approve of any stigmatization of humans. But anyway, as far as my bad habits, my dogs, that's it.
You mentioned
Obsession
it way
with my
earlier.
dogs.
You mentioned it earlier with lead poisoning, how you came to focus on lead. In your book, Brush with Death, A Social History of Lead Poisoning, you declared the United States is lead poisoned. You went on to write, our blossoming risk aversion has changed the way we eat, the way we drive, the way we raise our children, almost every aspect of modern life in the United States. A study of lead poisoning offers a significant opportunity to explore this cultural change. Has the U.S. made progress, or are we still just as lead poisoned as when you wrote that 23 years ago? And can you talk a little bit about some of the major changes from this cultural shift?
I've got to say, in my methods class and in the writings classes, I try to encourage people to write provocative beginnings to their pieces, pieces that will, have some kind of hook at the beginning. So that quote that you gave is actually the first line of the book. I start this 300-page book with that statement. That's, the United States is lead poisoned. It was a provocative way to start a serious book. And I knew that one segment of my readers would respond, hell yeah, it is. But another, and hopefully a larger segment of the readership would say, what the hell does that even mean? A country can't be lead poisoned. Or third segment of the audience who knew a little bit about what had happened over the last couple of generations, how we had outlawed lead and gasoline back in the 1970s with enormously healthy outcomes, that we really lowered the amount of lead poisoning, the amount of lead in our children's blood dropped precipitously over this time. And those people might read that sentence and say, what an ignorant thing to say. So my hope in doing that was, no matter how they responded to that first sentence, that they'd read at least to the end of the first couple of pages and see, what do I mean? And if they made it to the end of the book, they'd find out, that in the last sentence of the book, I start the last sentence of the book with exactly the same phrase. I say, America is lead poison. And everybody by then should know exactly what I mean. And I call for, it's time we do something about it. So it could be a call to action once you understand what this could possibly mean. To the question of what changed, that was actually at the heart of the, a lead poisoning expert in 1970 would have drooled at the prospect of what was coming. If he knew what was coming, he would just be astounded at the progress that was about to be made. And he would tell me with that first sentence, take the W, man, we did it, okay? But if he actually lived through that era, that expert would have simultaneously been celebrating that decline in toxicity that we all were living in, but they would also be really familiar with the serious harm from those lower and lower blood lead levels. And so this was new knowledge that was only made possible by the progress. The progress made new knowledge available. I mean, you can't know the damage that a few drops of lead does when everybody is swimming in this stuff. So that's kind of the story. It's this optimistic story of what can happen when a danger like lead poisoning is finally seen to be a universal threat instead of being a ghetto disease, which is what it had been from the 1940s to the 1970s. Everybody knew, with scare quotes, everybody knew that only ghetto children, African-American children in the slums were victims of this. And the racism of the language of the medical literature of the time is shocking. But once it was seen to be a universal threat, hey, we brought the hammer down. And today, when you look, where is lead poisoning a problem? The language is right back. Oh, it's Flint. Oh, it's Washington, D.C. in the slums. It's a ghetto disease again, which we can be upset about that. And we are, those who who get upset by those things. But at the same time, it feeds into a narrative of hopelessness, of being, of being something that is intractable. And because it's seen as a racial disease, we all know racial inequality is with us, and there's really nothing we can do. So it creates a hopelessness. If you really do look at Flint and other places, you'll see that the lead in the water in many, many places is just as high. Which isn't to say it was as high as it was in the 1970s, but it's still a problem. If we could see that universality, in other words, again, we would do something about it. But as long as it's seen as just little pockets of poisoning that is tied to an intractable problem, we're not going to do what we can. It is an expensive proposition, but it's a wonderful make-work proposition to dig up all the lead pipes. Think of all the plumbers you're going to hire. It's billions and billions of dollars to really finally fix the problem, but it would be a great economic stimulus. Not to mention all the IQ points we'd raise. It's a no-brainer.
Do you have any upcoming classes you have planned? Any new book projects or research that you want to give us a sneak peek of?
Definitely. In fall, I'm teaching a class that's based on the book I'm working on. It's not the first time I've taught this class. It's a really fun, it's fun for me. I hope it's fun for the students. My next project is this history of how Americans over the last 150 years or more have increasingly moved indoors in all manner of things. From how did laundry used to be done? It was done outdoors, and the laundry was dried on the clothesline, all the outdoor activity, all that. We used to be an agricultural society, blah, blah, blah. We've been moving more and more and more indoors to the point where we're practically hermetically sealed in our environments. So this class is coming up. It offers really a huge array of topics that people can write about. There are so many topics. It's so gender, race, environmentalism, politics, you name it. Everything from the military to capital punishment to the topics you wouldn't think could possibly be related. Students find ways to do really interesting research on, and it's a colloquium in the upper levels for the history department. And then I'm working on a couple of classes. It won't be offered this year, but that are related to the history of technology and environmental health, more conventionally understood. I want to do a course on race and medicine. It's a theme in all my stuff that I think deserves a good class.
Well, Carter usually gets to do this part. It's exciting. I get to do this part in this episode today. We'll start with, do you have a favorite book?
I knew this was coming because I have watched the other podcasts. And, I'm terrible with favorites, but this is not a flippant answer, okay? If I can ignore the controversy around some of this author's less brilliant work, I'm still going to go with One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish by Dr. Seuss. Now, despite it having some terrible gender stereotypes, like it says, all girls who like to brush and comb should have a pet like this at home. Boys like to brush and comb. But anyway, it in addition to accepting differences, which obviously it's also about understanding sadness and frustration and facing your irrational fears, like that vug under the rug, which my kids didn't want to read that page, but they did and they didn't, which is it's brilliant. It's all there. You might go so far as to say it's the Brothers Karamazov of children's literature.
Wonderfully put.
I'm so happy you said that. A favorite food?
That one's an easy one. My favorite food is the food that's on a plate in front of me.
I'll take
I don't mean right now. Yeah.
Favorite non-work activity?
This is one where, and I admire my colleagues. Their answers have been seemingly very honest. I think they are. When you ask an average American that question, they tend to give what you call an aspirational interest. Like I have 2 kayaks hanging on the garage door outside, and I have some decent photo equipment, and I have good binoculars for going bird watching. And so, these are aspirational things. I want to get out and kayak. I see myself as a kayaker, but in reality, how often do I actually do it? So I can't honestly answer that way. So the best answer I can give you that's most honest is music. I sing in a choir, which is a very small part of that. But I love to collect music. I love to listen to music, play piano a little bit. So that would be the closest thing. I'm so interested in so many things. I'm interested in learning. I feel like my college education with that theater degree was too focused and too narrow. I really, in my last years, I want to really just learn all the things I want to learn. But music is a big part of it.
Favorite thing to do in New York City?
Well, I know I'm supposed to say museums and theater, which I do love museums. And when I get to the theater, I always love it, but I don't make it part of what I really love when I end up having times, whether it's walking the campus of Brooklyn College or going into Central Park. I love people watching. The people of New York are so exciting, and there are more New Yorkers in New York than any place I've ever been. So it's a great place to people watch.
Finally, favorite music genre?
What day of the week is it? It varies so much. I mean, I have on my iPhone, I have 3 basic playlists. I have a jazz playlist, a classical playlist, and I have a music playlist. And what is that? What is that music? It's everything from Joni Mitchell to Frank Zappa to that's both old stuff to new contemporary, probably indie folk rock stuff, and with a little bit of twang. A guilty pleasure for me because there's nobody else in my family who can tolerate when the music that I play gets a little bit of Western twang to it. Shut down that hillbilly music. Well, I'm a Southern boy, so I get to do that. But no, what day of the week is it? That's my genre of music.
I appreciate that answer. I have I think a 43-hour playlist, so I have it has changes for me all the time too. So
isn't yours mostly yacht rock, as I understand?
That's, again, depends on the day of the week, depends on the, if it's the beach or if it's summer, then a nice yacht rock playlist.
Any day of the week that ends in Y. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always a good day then for Jay Ferguson or Rupert Holmes. So yeah.
Okay.
Professor Warren, this was so much fun. Thank you so much for doing
great.
this. This was awesome.
I hope you can excavate some coherence out of all this. Thank you very much. I had fun.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, thanks for doing this. This has been so much fun getting to know new things about my colleagues and hearing you guys and what you're doing for the students of the department. It's fantastic. And I know how much work it is because you actually read some of my stuff. So, man, thumbs up to you guys.
Thank you. Our Professor podcast was recorded with the permission of the Brooklyn College History Department and our student interviewees. We would like to thank both the students and faculty for their contributions.